Hello, and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. Thank you for joining us today for our program, The Human Side of Disasters, the People Behind the Faces. Our objectives today are to learn about the real people, specifically the volunteers behind the scenes of some of the world's most significant disasters of the past decades. Discuss different aspects of the disaster survivor mentality, and review some existing disaster plans and procedures, keeping the human element in mind. If you have a question about anything being discussed today, please call or email our faculty presenter during this live broadcast. The phone number and email address are on your screen now and will appear again later in the program. Also, the handouts are available online. You will need to register for this program in order to access those materials. There is no financial relationship between the planners of this program and the speaker. There is also no commercial support for this program. My name is Elena Parker Merriweather. I work in the Center for Emergency Preparedness as the Minority and Special Populations Coordinator and Medical Reserve Corps Coordinator. One of my roles is to coordinate disaster preparedness trainings and conferences for healthcare providers and responders. Our goal is to raise awareness around the needs of minority individuals, at-risk and vulnerable population groups during an emergency or disaster. Today's satellite program has been planned with this goal in mind. We hope to share information with you today about some of those important faces that we often do not see during and after a disaster. I would like to introduce our speaker this morning, Ms. Suzanne Bernier with SB Crisis Consulting from Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Elena. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and it's great to be talking to all of you today. So thank you so much. Before I start my presentation, I want to just preface it by saying that we've seen a lot of disasters. We see them daily across the world. There are some tragedies, devastation that we see every day, that we see on the media coverage. I used to be a member of the media, so I used to cover a lot of these events. However, there's a lot of things that we don't see in the media that are not specifically covered about the good things, the great things that we see in people and what they do to be able to help and respond, specifically people who are not paid to do those kinds of things. I'm not talking about first responders, people like us who are paid to plan and prepare and respond to disasters, but I'm just talking about everyday people who do some great things every time we see a disaster anywhere in the world. I'm only focusing on a few of them today, but I want, again, to tell everybody that I recognize and acknowledge that, yes, there are horrible things that happen with these tragedies, but there are also so many positive sides, and I want to just take this time to walk you through some of those behind-the-scenes everyday heroes that I've had the opportunity to meet throughout my career and sit down with them and gain some insight on what they did, why they did it, and how their whole story unfolded. And that's what I'd like to share with you today, the people behind the faces. As we start, I'm talking about disasters and how I used to be a media person. And I sort of, through an indirect way, ended up going from the media side to the government side, and then ended up becoming an emergency management field officer. I ended up being the first female emergency management field officer for our state emergency management agency in Ontario, Canada. Through that time, I responded to several disasters, including what was called the largest ice storm of the century, the ice storm of the century in eastern Canada, where we spent 5 weeks responding in the middle of January, which is very cold in eastern Canada, people without power for up to 5 weeks at a time. After that, I responded to evacuating whole First Nations communities along the James Bay coast, several train derailments, forest fires, floods, those kinds of things. So when I was in that role, I noticed every time I would go and respond to a disaster, the goodness of people, strangers who didn't know each other, that would come from other towns, sometimes other countries, to be able to help respond and stay to recover and rebuild. And so again, I'm going to share with you some of those stories today of some of those people that I've had the good fortune to meet. I wanted first, though, to tell you about this quote that I learned about several years ago by Mr. Rogers, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with the lovable Mr. Rogers and the Mr. Rogers show that some of us grew up with. And Mr. Rogers had been quoted saying that once when he was a little boy, he would run up to his mother and he would say when he saw some kind of a disaster or bad things happen, he would run to her crying and be scared. And his mother would respond by saying, whenever you see something like this and you're scared, just look around for the helpers. The helpers are everywhere, and that'll will give you some comfort. And Mr. Rogers said it did. So that's one of the messages I would like to relay as well. I would like for every parent to be able to go back and tell their children that yes, if they see death and devastation in the news on a daily basis, in movies and TV shows, to know and focus on those helpers that are all around there that you might not see, but know that they're out there, and they'll be there to help you if you're stuck in a disaster as well. Disaster Heroes is a book that I'm actually in the middle of writing, based a lot on most of these stories that I'm going to talk to you about today. What inspired me to do so was when I was first sent to New Orleans and help rebuild some of the population there with some of the critical infrastructure. I met the inspiration for this book. I met amazing people who've gone through incredible challenges after Hurricane Katrina, who were still in the middle of rebuilding, and as they still are. And through their stories and meeting the people on the ground who lived there and experienced that devastation, but were able to rise above and work with complete strangers who were coming from all across the world to help volunteer, it just told me that I wanted to share their stories with others, and I knew that there were other stories with every disaster. So I started seeking out other people that have done some amazing things, and then now I'm compiling their stories into this book. First, I'll talk about the first hero that inspired me to write the book in the first place after Hurricane Katrina. I'm not going to go into too much of these images, and I don't want to focus on the devastation. I know it was a horrible, incredible loss, and people are still suffering from what happened after Hurricane Katrina across several states. But I did want to, again, just bring up some of those images. But what I want to focus on, again, are some of the positive things that I took away after my first few trips from New Orleans. First of all, I want to talk about Bob and Fonda Walsh. Bob owns an office products company based out of New Orleans. He has 3 locations. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, he had about 100 employees, and they all had a wonderful, fabulous relationship from what I'm told and what I could see. It was like a family environment. So much so that after about a couple of weeks before Hurricane Katrina actually hit, Stanley Myers, who works for Bob in the warehouse, who did work for Bob in the warehouse, came up to Bob and Fonda, and he told them that he had been diagnosed recently with terminal cancer. A couple of weeks later, Hurricane Katrina hits. Bob and his wife, and I want to talk a bit about what they did and their reaction when they were observing what was happening. They were on higher ground and luckily were fortunately not affected by the hurricane. However, Bob was telling me that he and Fonda are watching television one night, watching the coverage of the destruction and devastation that's happening. And the first thing that came to their mind was the safety and security of their employees. How are our staff doing? I think this is an excellent example of what companies should be doing for their families, their employees, and their families anyway. So Bob and Fonda went ahead and tried in every means possible to try to locate and contact every one of their employees to confirm and make sure they were safe, or to see if they could help them and assist them in any way. It took them several days to finally get a count and realize that most of their employees were indeed safe and sound. What Bob and Fonda did above and beyond what a lot of companies might have chosen not to do and didn't do at the time was it took them several months to reopen their locations. In the meantime, they actually provided full salary for each and every one of their employees throughout that whole downtime period, which benefited in the end because they didn't lose any of their employees. Their employees didn't have to move to another city, to another state, to another country, as we saw happen with a lot of the New Orleans population specifically. As a result, when they were able to open back up a few months later, they were the only office products company that did so because they were the only office products company that still had staff remaining. Because of it, Bob said, in an indirect way, little did he know that just by doing the right thing, he was able to recoup the and gain extra money from those other competitors who had to close down because they hadn't supported their employees, and made over $2 million in additional profit that next year. Again, just by doing the right thing. He didn't mean to do that, but that's just ultimately what happened. But let's go back to Stanley Meyer's story. And that's where I first became involved and got to know Stanley as well as Bob and Fonda. So a group of us business continuity professionals were in New Orleans 18 months after Katrina, which was still, after 18 months, very much devastated. There was hardly any rebuilding started. There was still a huge piles of debris, and we were waiting for that to be cleaned up. In the meantime, you saw several hundred volunteers from all across the country and the world coming to pitch in and help. We were a group of business continuity professionals that were here in New Orleans for a conference and decided that we would stay behind, a bunch of us, and we would try to help rebuild. So we were assigned, our first assignment was to help rebuild Stanley Meyer's home. But I want to also mention that Bob and Fonda, his boss, chose to actually pay for every single piece of equipment and all of the supplies to be able to rebuild Stanley's home. All they were looking for was the manual labor to be able to actually gut the entire house and rebuild it inside to make it livable. Bob and Fonda wanted to make sure that Stanley and his family would be able to go back in and live in their home after it was devastated by Katrina, so that he could spend whatever amount of months or years that he had left to share with his family in their family home. And that's how I met them on my assignment, being an insulation installer for Stanley Meyer's home. I'm going to show you some of the images, and that's Bob in the white shirt overseeing the operations. And keep in mind, all of us that are volunteering and rebuilding Stanley's house at this time, we're not professional rebuilders. We were trained that morning on whatever our assignment was. A couple of people had skills, handyman skills, and they were assigned what would be appropriate for them. But again, I didn't really have those handyman skills, so I ended up in the installation installer, trained beforehand. But it was great. And so again, here's some, and these are all just business continuity people from all across the states, as well as Canada, who are volunteering to help rebuild. And that's a colleague from Boston who I met that day, who we were the installation queens, I like to call us. And here are Bob and Fonda Walsh, my heroes from New Orleans, only one of my many heroes in New Orleans, as well as Stanley Meyer's in front of their home that they'd helped rebuild. And Stanley, I'm happy to report, was able to move back in to his home with his family members and enjoy a few extra years before he unfortunately did pass away a couple of years ago. But again, we were able to make sure that Stanley Myers moved back into his home with his family to enjoy the last years of his life. And again, that's really directly as a result of the good heart and hard work that Bob and Fonda Walsh did to make sure that they supported all of their employees. I also want to mention another thing that Bob and Fonda Walsh did to support all of their other employees, those who lost their homes and were waiting for either FEMA trailers or insurance or support, which, by the way, they also helped them if they needed additional help in filling out those types of forms. They did that. In addition, they also sought out and rented entire homes and rooms to be able to accommodate their employees and their whole families, to be able to house them until they were able to get back on their feet again. So again, a wonderful example of good things that happen after these devastating experiences. Now I want to talk to you, again, same period of time when I was in New Orleans in 2007. Again, this is 18 months after Katrina hit. This is the organizer of Continuity Cares. His name's Bob Nakow. He's originally from California. He runs a magazine on business continuity, and he's the reason, actually, that we were all sent to New Orleans, was to attend and speak at his conference, which he thought was very appropriate to be held in New Orleans, even though originally they were thinking, well, it's still kind of close to Katrina. But he thought, you know what, if anything, maybe what we can do is volunteer afterwards and really get a look at, this is the work that we do. Let's go and see what happened and what really happens in these disasters and help. And so it's thanks to Bob that we were actually there to help rebuild and volunteer for that period of time. So this time around, this is Bob and I in a New Orleans fire hall, one of the last ones to be rebuilt by the time we got there 18 months later. And I just want to show you some of the images, and I want to share with you another story that's not specific to Hurricane Katrina, but it explains to you the relationships that we all develop as helpers around the world when we want to help each other after disasters. So specifically, I want to talk to you about Ronnie Goldman and Marty Plevel. Ronnie Goldman, the gentleman with the checkered shirt, was a phone technician in New Orleans. He's since retired, but at the time when I met him, he was still a phone technician for a company and he was based out of New Orleans. Marty Plevel, the other fellow in the navy blue shirt, is from New York, and at the time worked for that phone company as well, but in New York City. I met Ronnie and Marty that day in the fire hall as we were helping to rebuild one of those remaining fire halls that was still not accessible to the firefighters. And I asked them about their story because they seemed very friendly with each other, and I thought, wow, somebody from New York and somebody from New Orleans, what's your story? And they seemed incredibly close. So they shared with me their wonderful story. And I'll mention that Ronnie is actually the one that inspired me. Ronnie and Bob, actually, at this point, were the ones that inspired me to really find all of these other unsung heroes that are out there. So Ronnie talks to me about how after September 11th, 2001, Ronnie is watching the newscast late at night, the evening news with his wife. And they're watching the news, and they see President Bush at the time delivering an address to the nation from Ground Zero. He's standing on top of what Ronnie notices is the burned-out hull of a fire truck. Right away, apart from all of the devastating losses of human life that were taken that day, Ronnie noticed all of the vehicles that went in to respond and were completely destroyed as well. And Ronnie thought, what are they going to do now to help rebuild if they don't have half of their vehicles with their equipment to be able to do so? And how are they going to respond to other disasters or just regular fires or other events that are going to keep happening after this disaster? So Ronnie turned to his wife and he said, I think we need to do something. Maybe we can raise money or something to build and deliver a brand new fire truck to New York City on behalf of the state of Louisiana. I think that's something we could do. And so his wife turned to him and she said, well, then let's do it. The next day, Ronnie got on the phone to a local radio talk show and proposed his idea. And it was so well received that the governor then ended up contacting him and saying, you know what, I want to make this even bigger than us just trying to raise funds. Let's do this in a way where we're going to challenge every other state in the country to do the same. And that way we'll all be able to deliver something back to New York City from every state across America. Ronnie, in the meantime, went ahead and pursued, and across the state we saw this fundraising effort from fire departments all across the state of Louisiana, as well as other entities. In the end, after only a short few months, they were able to build and deliver 3 brand new fire trucks from the state of Louisiana to New York City. The first one was called the Spirit of Louisiana, and that's the one that I'm going to focus on with this story as well. So this is the Spirit of Louisiana, the first truck to be delivered to New York City. It had to make a detour, though, because the president wanted to recognize Ronnie as well as get familiar with the Spirit of Louisiana, the fire truck itself, and to say thank you on behalf of the country. And this is Ronnie being recognized by President Bush at the time, and you'll see the Spirit in the background. And that's Ronnie, his wife, and their daughter, again, who were all instrumental in raising these funds to be able to deliver these trucks to New York City. I want to also share with you a story that Ronnie shared with me. When he was going into New York City, he was not in the driver's seat. He was in the passenger seat. But he said one image that he will never forget that brings tears to his eyes every time he recalls it, and really did at the time that he experienced it as well, is as they were driving into the city, they were noticing children, school children, that were lined up on the sides of the street, welcoming them in to the city and waving flags and waving to them and saying thank you. And Ronnie said he's glad he wasn't driving at the time because he would have crashed into something, obviously, because he was welled up with tears, as you could imagine. But I also want to talk to you about how these things end up coming back to you and working out in the end in some strange ways. So, Ronnie, sorry, let me go back for a second. After this happened, they responded in New York City. They used that vehicle for several years. It ended up becoming a training vehicle, the Spirit of Louisiana. Then all of a sudden, Ronnie says, little did I know that a few years later, that truck would be coming right back to us to help us right here in New Orleans. And that's exactly what happened. And that's how Marty and Ronnie really became familiar with each other, was Marty helped coordinate to ensure that a bunch of New York City firefighters hopped right back on that Spirit of Louisiana fire truck and came right back to Louisiana to be able to help respond and rebuild after Hurricane Katrina. That was to be the end of the story. As far as I knew, I keep tabs on what happens with the Spirit, and Ronnie and I are good friends now. And the last I had heard was that the Spirit was then now decommissioned, and it was in a fire museum in Baton Rouge, Louisiana for a few years. Fast forward a couple of years, Hurricane Sandy happens in the New York, New Jersey area specifically, and the truck, the Spirit, is taken out of the museum, recommissioned, reassigned, and sent back with a bunch of, again, Louisiana firefighters hopping right back on the Spirit and going right down to the New York area to help respond and rebuild after that disaster. So again, I think that story is just an amazing story about how just one act was able to help several different states at several different emergencies at different times. And no one would have known that in the beginning. Ronnie would have not known that. But in the end, he ended up saving so many people just by thinking of this great idea to raise funds. I also want to mention, though, that every one of these stories and everybody that I met and talked to, one of the things that I saw was it took one person to come up with an idea, but I would say they're the leaders of the helpers. But once that one person came up with the idea, you saw everybody else then lining up to help. So I'm focusing on one person for each one of these stories, but I must say that after hearing all of these stories and what went down, it was more about one person taking the first initiative to do something, but then everybody coming on board afterwards. So in every one of these stories, this is not just about the one hero I'm focusing on, but it's about the entire community that jumped in as well to help out. And of course, Ronnie and Sandy and I still hang out and are great friends, and I just had dinner with them again in April. And this is us in April, and you'll see Ronnie up there on the top and myself out in the front. And again, that's a lot of us who, ever since 2007, have been going back to help rebuild critical infrastructure, schools, homes. This one is actually a war veterans home in New Orleans. And so again, a bunch of us keep going back every year to help rebuild as much as we can. Now I'll talk a little bit about, and I didn't want to focus so much on the first responders, but I really do want to share Troy's story with you and my story with Troy, because again, it shows you how we all have this connection, the helpers that are out there. And so Troy, I met Troy that weekend when we were rebuilding the fire hall. Troy's showing you there the level of water that was reached at that specific fire hall. So not enough to completely destroy the fire hall, but definitely enough to create enough damage that it was not livable and they could not perform any of their duties or sleep in that station as they normally did. As a result, again, this is 18 months afterwards, they were still sleeping in a FEMA trailer when they were there, working out of a FEMA trailer, then going home out of the FEMA trailer. Troy had told me that he, his family, his dad, most of his family had lost their homes and were waiting, some for several years, to be able to rebuild. In the meantime, they were, again, living in FEMA trailers, going to work in FEMA trailers, sleeping in FEMA trailers. That was their life for over 2 years. Yet Troy had a duty to take care of. He had duties to go and seek out people, to see if he could find live people, to see what he could do to help. So he's telling me of all these tragic stories, these assignments that he has to go through, while he himself has no home to go to, while he himself is worried about the safety and security of his own family members and himself. So again, a lot of great first responder heroes too, so I just wanted to throw this one in. And these are some of the firefighters as well as the volunteers that day who helped to rebuild that fire hall. I just wanted to show you that image and wanted to show you this one because again, this just explains a bit of the connection that we all have once we start volunteering and working together during disasters. Troy, before we're leaving to get on the bus to leave, all of the volunteers, runs up and takes off his fire department T-shirt and gives it to me and says, "This is to thank you for helping us rebuild and coming all the way from Canada to help rebuild." And of course, it was a great moment, and I started crying, and then we took pictures, and we stayed in touch. Every 6 months or so, I'd get an email or a call, or I'd call Troy or something just to keep tabs and see how he was doing. And then, about, I'd say, I guess, 6 years after I'd originally first met Troy, I get a call from him out of the blue, and he says, "What's up?" And I said, "Oh, I'm so excited because I've just been asked to speak in Australia, and I'm going to get to go to Australia in 2 weeks." And the first thing Troy says is, "Remember, you owe me a T-shirt." So I thought right away, I do in fact. So my whole goal, once I got to Australia, was to find Troy a fire department T-shirt from Australia. So I did. This is myself with the group of State Emergency Services volunteers from New South Wales in Australia, a great, amazing group. I did a presentation similar to this one, talking about disaster heroes, but also about how to use social media during disasters. And afterwards, I gave a shout out to everybody in the audience. And I had told Troy's story and said, I would love to be able to bring Troy a T-shirt back from a fire services department here in Australia as I was going back to New Orleans right after I returned to Canada. I ended up getting several T-shirts, caps, so many things that you could imagine. I'm still getting things sent in the mail to me from some of these incredible people in Australia. And so these are some of them here with the State Emergency Services offices in New South Wales. And there I am afterwards, after the conference, flying right back to New Orleans, meeting with Troy all those years later and delivering to him a State Emergency Services T-shirt. And so here are just some of the images of some of the other projects that we've been involved in over the years since Katrina up to date. And those are, again, some of the volunteers. All of us, again, are just regular emergency managers or business continuity planners from all over North America that come most every year to be able to help rebuild. Now I want to shift the focus to Hurricane Sandy and talk about one specific story from Hurricane Sandy. And I'm sure you all remember the images and the devastation that was felt throughout some states after that as well. But I want to talk to you again about a local hero that I saw. So this really focuses on the human resiliency that I see, and I'm sure those of you who are in the field that respond have seen it and will see it over and over again as well. How, as humans, we are able to recover and rebuild and move on through the most devastating challenges. We saw it through Katrina, we saw it in Sandy, we see it in every disaster. And I'm not saying I'm downplaying any of the other ones at all, but this is just one that I happen to be personally involved with and got to be able to really witness and meet with some of those local heroes. So here's Staten Island, 2 weeks after Hurricane Sandy hit. I call myself a self-entitled volunteerist. And what that is really is I just fly myself. If I've got the time and the ability financially and otherwise to be able to do so, I'll just fly myself to wherever something has happened to see how I can help. I waited a couple of weeks before going to Sandy because I didn't want to be involved while they're doing the initial cleanup, and I thought I would be most best to be able to provide some service to them after that initial cleanup was done. So after 2 weeks, I ended up being stationed in Staten Island to help feed and provide assistance to some of the residents of one of the areas that was most devastated during Hurricane Sandy on Staten Island specifically. So here you see some of the supplies that were regularly coming in, being shipped in through different organizations. And there I am in the baby tent. And I'll just give you a little story on the side about that. I don't know anything about babies. I've never had a baby. And I was assigned originally to the baby tent. And they're showing me all of the different areas and what to give out and how many to dole out. And then they get to the diapers. And then I ask, diapers come in different sizes? So then they promptly removed me from the infant area and brought me to the food tent instead. And so that's where my assignment was, and that was amazing because I'm very familiar with food. So here's the food tent, and this is Rudy in the red vest that you see. And Rudy's the one that I want to talk to you about specifically for this story. Rudy, I start talking to him, but first I had heard from other people before I got assigned to the food tent. Rudy was there every single morning ever since Sandy hit. He'd be there 5 o'clock in the morning with these big vats making his homemade batches of soup. And he'd be there for 15 to 17 hours a day on his feet serving these soup and sandwiches to all of the residents who, some of them had lost their homes, or at least had lost access to their homes for several weeks without power or any other amenities. So they had nowhere to go, and they had nowhere to go to get warm meals, except for these kinds of areas. So I started noticing the relationship that Rudy was developing with all these people that were lined up for food. And I thought, that's incredible, what a relationship they have. And these people were just talking to them, sharing their stories with them. I could see how therapeutic it was for those people to be able to tell their stories and just be able to sit down and talk with somebody that they felt comfortable with. And that was really who Rudy was. But then I start talking to Rudy as we're assigned together, and then I find out Rudy actually lost complete access to his home. His home was destroyed by Hurricane Sandy. His family was safe, and they were going to be rebuilding the home, and that was what mattered to Rudy, he said, was that he was safe, his family was safe. What he thought his duty and responsibility was, as a member of that community, was to be there to support the rest of those citizens that weren't as fortunate as he and his family were. So that's Rudy, and that again is an example just of one of those heroes, those survivors out there of many that just have that attitude where as long as their family is safe, they want to be able to provide assistance and help to their community as much as possible. And so that's why Rudy's one of my favorite heroes as well. Rudy and I now have a friendship too, and we keep in touch as well. And there's Rudy and I after feeding about 1,500 people on that one day that we worked together on Staten Island. Now I'm going to talk about the Joplin tornado, which I'm sure many of you recall. I know that we're in the middle of Tornado Alley here, and I know that many of you have probably either faced, experienced, know somebody who has, or have even responded to similar events, such as the Joplin tornado. So I'm just focusing on this one today because I had the opportunity to meet with a couple of people who did a creative, innovative thing that had never been done before in response to an emergency that helped reunite some loved ones, potentially save some lives, and help be able to get supplies out to people that were affected by this specific tornado. This is Rebecca and Genevieve Williams, and you'll see David Burton in the middle, but I'm going to focus specifically on Rebecca and Genevieve. Rebecca and Genevieve are a mother and daughter team. They live just outside of Joplin, but Joplin is their hometown. They were living just outside of Joplin when the tornado touched down that Sunday afternoon. They were watching, and they were not affected, but as soon as they heard the devastation that happened to their own hometown, they immediately thought, what can they do to help? Now, the mother had quite a bit of volunteer experience in working different areas before, but her daughter didn't at all. But her daughter had just recently graduated from being educated in social media. And social media has evolved a lot over the past couple of years. Back then, just in 2011, no one really tweeted, no one really used Twitter. Yeah, people used Facebook, but specifically to talk to their friends, to post things, and, you know, that kind of thing. Maybe parents to monitor their children on it. That's really what Facebook was being used for still back in those days, just a couple of years ago. Well, because Genevieve had just come out of social media school and was sort of somewhat of a social media guru, she thought, well, what if we use Facebook to be able to create a community page just dedicated, and we'll call it Joplin Tornado Info. And we'll get that message out to all of the community members that for the most recent, up-to-date, any kind of information they need on where to get supplies, or how to locate loved ones, or where to charge their cell phones and their laptops, or any other kind of information. Let's put that all into a Facebook page so that everybody knows that that's where they can go for whatever information they need, and they'll know it's the most up-to-date information. Now, this happens, and we see this happen regularly. In 2012, we saw it happen with Hurricane Sandy, where, yes, we saw the great effective use of social media during disasters. But keep in mind, this was in 2011. This was the first time a U.S. community had thought of using social media to respond during disasters. At first, some organizations were a little bit wary of a community going ahead and doing that, especially to people who were not professionals in the area. But in the end, because they did such a phenomenal job keeping that page up to date and responding to every single inquiry that they received on that page for several weeks, and it's still active, just so you know as well, so feel free to Google it, Joplin Tornado Info. Just because of the great work that they were able to do, they were since heralded by organizations across the country, as well as FEMA, on it being an effective model that every community should be encouraged to develop, to try to use social media to their advantage during a disaster. So I actually had the opportunity to fly out after the tornado to meet and sit down with Rebecca and Genevieve. And they told me their story, and again, incredible people who had no background at all in emergency management, but ended up saving thousands of people. And here are some of those images following the tornado. I want to focus, though, on one. This image I really do, it just really hits my heart. This was the Joplin High School, and you can see that the J, the L-I-N of Joplin were blown off after the tornado, but then somebody changed that high school to Hope High School with some creative duct tape work there. But I think it just really reflects the strength and the heart that community had, as every community does when they pull together after a disaster and move on. And here's a memorial for those who passed away during the Joplin tornado. There were 158 people who died that day. And I also want to show you a tribute to the volunteers that was erected there in Joplin as well. So again, that community really recognized how much the volunteers from all across the nation helped to respond and rebuild that community, as we see in every disaster across this nation. This is the spirit tree, which apparently was the only thing standing in that whole area after the tornado. Now, I want to take you to a different type of a disaster. It really isn't what we would call a disaster because everybody survived. But not everybody would have survived if it were not for one of the unsung behind-the-scenes heroes that I'm going to talk to you about now. So everybody remembers the Miracle on the Hudson, I'm sure, where we had, and everybody heard of, Captain Sully, or Captain Sullenberger, who was actually, of course, the hero. We saw Sully everywhere in the news afterwards. He definitely was a hero. He safely landed that plane on the Hudson River and saved everybody's lives. However, I want to talk to you about another one of the heroes that you may not have heard about, that really was responsible for actually saving the one person who could well have been the one casualty from that landing that day. Captain Muhammad Gouda, you see him here with Captain Sully. Captain Muhammad Gouda is a captain of a ferry boat that ferries people from New York City to Staten Island every day. It was the morning when he observed, when he was starting his shift, it was just himself and crew members at the time, no passengers on board his ferry boat, when he witnessed the flight going down. At first he had no idea, almost fearing that it could be a potential terrorist attack. Of course, in that city, everybody still has that fear when they see a wayward plane. However, it didn't take him long, he said, to realize that there was something wrong mechanically with this plane, and it was trying to land on the river, and it was going into the river. They witnessed the landing, the perfect landing on the river, and the first thing that came to Captain Muhammad's mind was, we have to go there and save these people. So he and his crew went straight over, and you'll remember seeing the images on the news. For those of you that might not have been there, you've seen the images on the news of everybody being evacuated onto the wings of the plane. Well, it was late fall, pretty brisk and very cold waters at that time in New York City. And people were, you saw them sliding off the wings. The wings were icing up. It was very cold. There was one woman in particular who actually lost her grip, couldn't get it back, and slipped down into the waters. Captain Muhammad Gouda and his crew were the ones to actually rescue her and pull her from those frigid waters and pull her onto the deck, and essentially saved her life after she admitted to the captain that she didn't know how to swim, and she didn't think she would have made it if she wasn't recovered by Captain Muhammad Gouda that day. So again, I had the good fortune of sitting down with Muhammad and him telling me his story, and he also told me about another story casually on the side where he actually helped rescue 3 other survivors from a tugboat being overturned in that same river just several months later. So now I call him the 2-time hero on the Hudson. I want to talk to you now about another innovative and creative way somebody who's not a part of the emergency management field helped to be able to rebuild and help community members recover after the Japan tsunami specifically. And I'm sure you all remember the images that you saw then. This is Nobuyuki Kobayashi. He's a pretty famous and important photographer in the Tokyo area of Japan. He wasn't in the area that was affected by the earthquake or the tsunami. However, he watched it, and in complete horror, of course, as everybody across that country did. And he thought, what could he do to help afterwards? And one of the things that came to his mind right away was people had lost in 2 of these communities specifically that were completely devastated. Not only had they lost their homes and everything within their homes, but they had lost some things that are most precious in the Japanese culture, which are their family photos and family portraits and photo albums. And so what he thought he could do was round up a bunch of professional photographers, makeup artists, studio professionals, and they went to that devastated area. They set up makeshift photo studios, and they wanted to give back something to the community. And so they ended up taking family portraits for all of those over 2,000 people who had lost everything, to give them a sign of a new beginning. And that was what these new family portraits were for, was to reflect and be a sign of a new beginning for people. And it was amazing that that act itself, it really encouraged people and brought smiles to people's faces in the deepest of tragedy. And I'll show you, again, some reminders of what happened after that tsunami in Japan in 2011. And now here's this makeshift photo studio with Nobuyuki and some of his subjects. I'll talk a little bit more about this image in a bit, but I also want to mention that Nobuyuki is traveling across the world now with the images that he was able to take from those survivors to be able to give the message out to people across the world to raise awareness and potentially raise funds and assistance to be able to help those areas that are still, of course, in the middle of rebuilding as we speak. I want to share with you this one specific story that Nobuyuki told me about. So this woman was one of the women that lost everything, including one of her closest friends during the tsunami. Her eye was also injured in the tsunami as well, with a flying piece of debris. When she showed up to the photo studios, she would only wear sunglasses and refused to take them off. Before her session, Nobuyuki was trying to convince her to take off the sunglasses, it'd be much better to see your face, and she kept saying no, and then she told Nobuyuki her story. And then finally, because of everybody else that she saw around her and the support that she was given, Nobuyuki was able to convince her to take off those glasses and pose. And they didn't tell anybody before. I'm going to show you these images of others that were posed. They never told anybody to smile. All they said was just do whatever you feel, or what you're feeling right now. And that's all I want you to do in front of the camera. So she ended up deciding to be brave enough to take off those sunglasses for the first time. She reached for a small bouquet of flowers, and she took this picture. And Nobuyuki told me afterwards that she didn't put those sunglasses back on after this picture. And here are some of those other family portraits. And again, I want to remind you all that most of these people really are smiling, yet they went through some devastating loss, and they saw tragedy, as a lot of people do in different disasters across the world. Yet they all chose to smile without even being told to, because they knew that at least they had made it through, and their life was what was important. They were survivors, and they were going to move on. And these now are the photos to prove the start of their new beginnings and their new lives. And there's, again, one of my favorite new heroes in Japan, Nobuyuki Kobayashi. There's some of the children being made up. And now, another thing that was great was Nobuyuki involved the school system, the primary school system, to involve them in actually helping to frame all of these portraits once they were taken, and also write messages of support and love and kindness to the families attached to every photo that was delivered to those family members. I want to talk to you now about a hero that I met that's really responsible for saving the lives of those Chilean miners that I'm sure you all remember after the Chilean mine collapse that we all watched on television for several days as that rescue was progressing. This is Brandon Fisher. He's the owner of Center Rock, and it's a mining supply and mining drilling company that he owns based out of a small town in Berlin called Berlin, Pennsylvania. And Brandon, after the mine collapse, is watching the news with his wife and watching a report of the Chilean president at the time telling the people of Chile of the Plan A, which some of you might still remember. There was talk of a Plan A and a Plan B while the drilling procedures were going on. So Plan A was in the midst of being done, but if you all remember, the drill kept breaking. They kept having severe challenges. They were figuring, they estimated it would take about 60 days until they were able to actually reach the miners. Well, Brandon's watching. He'd been involved in a couple of different mine rescues right here in the U.S. And just knowing the type of rock that they were dealing with, the distance involved, he knew that after 60 days, first of all, they'd be challenged in meeting that with the equipment they had, but also that they were pretty much guaranteed they would lose lives. It would take a lot less time to be able to rescue those men. If they left it to 60 days, they may very well have lost their lives and perished in that mine. Brandon said he knew that he had the drill that would be able to save those men in half that time. But he didn't know anybody in Chile, nobody whatsoever. So he decided, he and his wife tried desperately in all ways they could to try to find somebody within the Chilean government that would listen to them, to say, listen, we don't want to charge you anything. All we want is to give you and send you the drill that we know will be able to rescue your men in half the time that you've projected. It took them 2 weeks, but they were able to do it. After 2 and a bit weeks, they were able to get on the line with somebody in Chile, with the Chilean government, and convince them that they would be Plan B. In the end, after getting permission to do so, Brandon himself went and sent his entire team, as well as all of the equipment and the drills and the drill bits that were needed to drill down for 30-some days to be able to then reach those miners, and they did. They actually estimated, I think it was 33 days that it would take to be able to touch those miners, and it actually took them less one day. So within 32 days, they were able to reach those miners. And so here's some images of the team that worked on developing the bits of the drill that were sent there. Here's the team on site working with some of the Chilean team as well. And here's the group. You'll notice some of the bands that they're wearing, and they all say 33 on it, and that's to represent the 33 lives that they were there to save. And I talked to Brandon. I went to visit Brandon afterwards. He took me for a tour of where they actually made the drills and the drill bits, which was incredible to see. And also it was incredible to hear his story and how he recounted what happened those 30-some days that they were on site in Chile. And he also told me that, unfortunately, he wasn't able to stay behind and actually meet those people in person, the miners, as they were coming up. You all remember seeing them coming up one by one in the capsules. Well, he said that everybody in a disaster rescue operation, as you may already aware, they have their specific assignments and then they have to leave. So their duty was to go in and drill down and get that hole finished, so that then right away they could disperse, move out of the way, so that the capsule team could then come in and actually rescue the miners. So unfortunately, as soon as they were completed their job of drilling, they all had to disperse. They went back home. So they actually all sat in Brandon's living room back in Berlin, Pennsylvania, and watched the rescue one by one with tears in their eyes. You still see pictures and images of 33 lives all over Brandon's office and his home as well. So that in the middle are Brandon and his wife. And I said to him after the interview, I said, it's too bad you never did get to finally meet meet the miners? And he said, oh, no, but I did, actually. I got to meet 3 of them. And there was a Boston Gala event in their honor that was held about a year afterwards. And Brandon and his wife were invited to be the special guests of honor there, and they were able to finally meet 3 of those miners that they rescued and say hello and thank you in person, which was just an amazingly touching experience, Brandon said, for him and his wife to be able to do that. Brandon actually was communicating with some of these miners back and forth from up above while they were drilling down. And specifically, one of these recognized him and said, "You're the one with the really bad Spanish that was talking to us." So again, it was great that they were were able to put a face to each other and actually thank each other in person for what happened throughout those 30-some days in Chile. And now what I want to do is I'm going to fast forward through this because we're running out of time, and I want to talk to you about one other entity, which is a large entity now, but really did some great things as well after 9/11. It's a project or a foundation now that's called New York Says Thank You. You may be familiar with it because now it is an actual large entity. But why I want to talk a little bit about this story for a couple of minutes is because I want to show that it doesn't matter how old or young we are, you can come up with a great idea that, again, will be the leader to then enable all of these helpers to come through and help you to be able to respond and rebuild after disasters. Specifically, I want to talk to you about Evan Parnas. Evan is the creator, ultimately, of New York Says Thank You Foundation. Evan, 2 years after 9/11 occurred, Evan's from New York City. He and his family were fortunately unharmed, but knew a lot of people who were directly affected by that tragic loss. After the California wildfires, a couple of years later, Evan was watching the death and devastation from that and turned to his father and he said, "Dad, I want to do something for those kids. All those kids have lost everything. Let's send them all my toys and all my stuffed animals." And so Jeff said, "Evan, that's a great idea." Evan was only 5 years old when he made this suggestion to his dad. And his dad, at the time, was in private industry. And he said, "You know what, Evan, that's a great idea. Let's try to make this bigger than that and see if all your friends and your school friends want to donate as well." So the first ever delivery from New York Says Thank You was with a small U-Haul truck filled with Evan and his father and a bunch of toys and donated stuffed animals. And they drove all the way from New York City to California with a banner on that U-Truck saying, "New York Says Thank You." And their message really was, because of all of the outpouring of support and assistance that they'd seen from people across this nation after 9/11 specifically, they wanted to figure out a way to give back to all those communities who came together to help New York City after 9/11. Since that U-Haul trip to California a couple years after 9/11, it has now become this huge foundation that has helped communities across the U.S. as well as now in different countries to help rebuild. But what's so special about this story as well is most of the people, the volunteers who go to these different states and these different countries to help them rebuild after disasters are disaster survivors themselves. Either family members who might have lost loved ones in that disaster of 9/11, first responders who were directly impacted and affected, who lost colleagues and friends and loved ones in that disaster. It helped them also be able to try to give back. And so Evan and his dad told me after I met with them on how inspiring and invigorating that was for the survivors to be able to recognize and give back to other communities who were in disasters as well. So here are some of the images now of what's a much larger foundation than when it started off. And there's an actual movie about the New York Says Thank You Foundation, which might be of interest to you. So you can Google it, and it's on there, and it'll tell you all the incredible story about Jeff and Evan Parnas and their wonderful idea. Thank you. And I'm also on Twitter, so for those of you who follow or who are on Twitter, I'd encourage you to follow me, and that's my Twitter handle, @SBCrisis.
And as New York says thank you, the Center for Emergency Preparedness of the Alabama Department of Public Health says thank you for helping us to see and understand the human side of disasters and the many faces of the heroes who assisted with all of the natural disasters that have occurred, especially with Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, 9/11, and several of the others that you mentioned, because oftentimes we don't talk a lot about the human side of those faces. And we appreciate you bringing that information to us, and we appreciate you for being the hero that captured the heroes behind the disasters. So thank you very much. We appreciate everyone for joining us today for our program, The Human Side of Disasters, The People Behind the Faces. We hope that you've learned a lot of good information from today and hope that you will be joining us for future programs. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you have a nice day.